because you don't want Austin taxpayers and Austin's tax-paying money to be used to profit from occupation. You know, at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter whether you win the vote on the council or not. What matters is that's been the basis for a year-long campaign, to educate people about why what happens with their tax money has an impact for Palestinian children and women and old men, and has an impact back home in terms of how we're viewed and what makes us safe and doesn't make us safe. So these questions about the role of the U.S., the role of U.S. policy in enabling these criminal acts, to me becomes the centerpiece of what we need to be mobilizing around. And it's for that reason that I think we can best create real campaigns, not events. We all know how to do events. You know, you do a film showing, you bring a speaker, and those are great, but that's not a campaign. That doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't even change Austin. It might reach one person or something, it might reach somebody, but until you have an ongoing campaign that builds on itself, that brings more people in, that engages with who are your real allies, who are the other people that are searching for jobs here in Austin. You know, there's this great website, many of you know it, I'm sure, the National Priorities Project, that you go to their website and it will tell you exactly how much of your tax money here in Austin, in your county, the state of Texas, your congressional district, any of these, you know, distinctions, it will tell you how much of your tax money is going to pay for the war in Iraq, for the war in Afghanistan, for the two wars plus this year's military budget, any of those combinations. And luckily for us, the cost of the escalation in Afghanistan this year is exactly the same as U.S. aid to Israel this year. So it's all right there. Also, the U.S. campaign has a new website called aidtoisrael.org that will give you that same set of numbers for your city, your state, your congressional district, how much tax money you're paying this year. That's the tool for the basis of your alliance with people that are fighting for jobs, that are fighting for housing, that are fighting for health care, who are saying, where's our money? Our money is going off to commit human rights violations of this level by Israel on the high seas with this kind of piracy-like actions. That's the basis to go to the Community Organization for Fair Housing, for the Jobs Coalition, for the Immigrant Rights, this and that, for all of these organizations who don't really know much about the military budget, don't really know much about U.S. aid to Israel. They're not familiar with it, they haven't, but they know where their money's not available. And that's because we have this great gift from the Bush administration, thank you, George, to say, we're giving $30 billion all at once, we're committing $30 billion all at once. That's huge. That's huge. So let me stop with this thought, and that is that to the degree that we can shape all of our work in solidarity with the Palestinian right to not have to live under siege like in Gaza, to not live under occupation like the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to not have to live without the right to go home like all of the Palestinian refugees. The best thing we can do for that struggle is to change the policies of our own government. It's harder, it's not as much fun, it's not as much a response to the urgency that we sometimes feel when something happens like the attack on Mavi Maramara. The U.S. drafted that language. And we met the guy, we actually met the guy from the State Department who had drafted it, and I remember saying to him, what were you thinking? You know, why would you put that in there? The U.S. doesn't believe in that. And he literally started laughing, and he goes like this, he gestures, and he says, we knew nobody would take it seriously. We just put it in there as a sop to the other countries because we wanted to get them on board. It was so cynical, you know. But the reality was, I mean, although I sort of got on my high horse and said, well, what do you mean? We take it seriously. And he looked at me like, yeah, really? You and who else? You know? And I couldn't argue with him because the reality was nobody in power took it seriously. Not in the press, not in the government, not in the military. So our job, it seems to me, is not only to say in the abstract, we should be supporting a nuclear weapons-free zone throughout the Middle East, but reminding people that we're already on record supporting a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, And why aren't we implementing it? We wrote it, we signed on to it, what's the problem, you know? So it's a huge way of talking about it.
And, you know, there's domestic law in the United States that says the U.S. can't sell weapons to countries involved in offensive operations, you know, crimes against peace and things. Is there anything about an open acknowledgement of the nuclear arsenal that would trigger some sort of domestic law that would block? Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, there's stuff about not providing nuclear material or information to any country that has nuclear weapons. As far as I know, there's not a claim that the U.S. is providing that to Israel. France did for many years. It didn't come primarily from the U.S. The domestic law is primarily the Arms Export Control Act, which has to do with the use of conventional weapons, which Israel is violating all over the place. And that requires Congress, any member of Congress, can demand of the State Department an investigation. Just an investigation. You don't have to, you know, say anything more. An investigation of whether there have been, because there has been credible accusations, an investigation of whether there have been violations of the Arms Export Control Act that prohibits the use of U.S.-provided weapons for anything other than a very narrow definition of legitimate military use, which is basically within the territory of the country and for very narrow self-defense purposes. When the Israelis use it to attack Gaza, neither of those things obtain. So there's a lot of work, and I would refer people on this. The U.S. campaign website, which is endtheoccupation.org, it's an easy one to remember. If you look at the section on military aid, or go to the new website, which has this really cool map, it's fabulous. You can click on a county, a city, or whatever, and all this stuff pops up. It pops up how much tax money that entity has spent this year, what else that money could be used for housing, for jobs, for health care, and for something else. Who is the member of Congress? How did they vote on the last 5 issues affecting Israel-Palestine relations? Who are the member organizations of the U.S. campaign in that region, and how can you reach them? It's all kinds of great stuff. So that's aidtoisrael.org on this map you click on. But the U.S. campaign website overall, and theoccupation.org, has a bunch of stuff about the Arms Export Control Act, about how military aid works. There's a network of people working, it's called the Congressional District Coordinator Network, the CDC network, that's linking people around the country trying to pull together work around military aid. So use student groups, I mean everybody. It would be great to join that. If your organizations are not yet members of the U.S. campaign, I urge you to join it as soon as you can.
There's a great disconnect between what the people of this country want, and we've seen it in the past with the run-up to the Iraq War, and what the government is actually going to do. In a way, it doesn't seem like, even if we convinced most of the people in the United States about what's happening, that between Congress and the President, they're still going to do whatever they're going to do. How do you think it's possible to bridge that gap?
Okay, another easy question. One more.
Yeah, mine was kind of really basic. What's your interpretation of what Israel is doing in the West Bank? I wonder if what we're witnessing is really annexation.
I think that what Israel is doing in the West Bank is very much about annexation. It's about identifying, expanding the land and narrowing the number of Palestinians in what will become a an Israeli state. The Israeli notion of a two-state solution, in my view, is no longer viable, if it ever was. And I think it probably was. I mean, you could imagine, in the abstract, a state made up of all of Gaza, all of the West Bank, and all of East Jerusalem that would be somehow survivable. It wouldn't be great, but it could manage. What we now have, through the creation of the wall in the West Bank and the checkpoints and the apartheid roads that separate Palestinian villages from each other, is a huge network of a divided set of cantons that are not contiguous. And one of the great things that Ariel Sharon did before he died was to invent this category that he called transportational contiguity. Great term, one of those great technical terms, that basically said, if you can drive from here to there, we'll call it contiguous.